Okay, well, let's begin. We'll be waiting for Dodie, I guess, she might be late. So, so we can either start with 10 or go back to some other things. Uh, Probably let's start with 10 and see where that takes us. So he goes, I suggested why he deals with pleasure so much, but I failed to mention that in this, oh, here comes Lucy. In this book, he ends up talking about what flourishing really is. So in some ways, he's finally got to that, to answer that question, which he started out with which was, what is the ultimate good? And in book 10, he's very explicit. The ultimate good is one of flourishing, a life that is active and exhibits the virtues that he has been writing about.
Could one live a flourishing life without necessarily having achieved all of the virtues?
He's kind of ambiguous, isn't he, about that? He does talk about there being good people who are, by judging by the virtues, including the intellect one, who aren't completely virtuous, but still are good people. He seems to allow that, and then he goes back to this ideal where they are only the really good people act virtuously all the time. So I think there's an ambiguity there. I like the way he goes back always to talk about what are real human beings like and what are they capable of.
Right.
Yeah. Ron?
Oh. He also makes the point that that there is some difference in terms of the merit of the different virtues that we can. We're faced frequently with choices between more or less of different virtues that we may decide to favor one versus another. To some extent, there's a trade-off between them. At least that's the way I read what he had to say. That comes back to the point about having to have all of the virtues in hand to be a truly virtuous person.
Do you have any sense that there seems to be an infinite number of virtuous possibilities, or is it limited to the ones that he listed?
Yeah, I had the feeling that it was limited. At least his example was not that elastic, I didn't think.
But there are some that aren't listed there. But for the sake of the discussion, he was referencing the ones that he listed.
Yeah, I had the impression that perhaps he considered those the names that he gave things to be somewhat flexible or elastic, more inclusive perhaps than the literal meaning of the word. And yet, when I looked for that, for example, a couple of weeks ago we talked about where is kindness on here, and it didn't seem to be there. Though I had the impression, I think, from Forrest that it was that the subsequent that one of the next chapters would make it clear that kindness was indeed there. The closest I could come to kindness was fairness. You treat people fairly, and yet to me, those two things are not the same. Fair treatment is not the same thing as kind treatment. In most situations, you treat people fairly because they deserve to be treated fairly. Well, okay, people deserve to be treated kindly as well, but that seems to involve something more than simple fairness. So that bothers me a little bit, that I still don't see enough universality in this list to satisfy me that this is a prescription for virtue, for true virtue, a virtuous life, whatever.
Yeah. It seems too cut and dry.
Yeah.
It's also the case that another attribute that I would suggest might be considered as a virtue, piety. The translator made quite a big thing about this in his introduction, is completely missing. But in this chapter, we discover that emulating the characteristics of the gods is part of the way in which we discover our own virtuousness, or in which we use their example as reference points for our own. So even if Aristotle refuses to subordinate himself to the greater goods produced by the example of the gods in general, here it is in the last chapter, being brought around again. Still no mention of subordination, no mention of the virtue of piety. Another missing virtue, as it were.
But the Greek gods were not all that virtuous all the time. They had some serious character flaws, the Greek gods. So not sure, whether that's an idealized version of the Greek god religion that Aristotle believed or not. But certainly the stories of the Greek gods is not one of great virtue in all cases. In many cases, it may be.
It is his rationality, which is like the divine, which is the best way to live. Yeah, he uses the word divine, but he really doesn't wade into the waters of the personalities of the gods, which are pretty, in many cases, terrible. The reality is the Greek gods were not, they were jealous, they power crazy. They were nuts in a way. I just don't think Aristotle, when he talked about reason being our divine nature, I think he just skipped the whole idea of what it meant to be a Greek god.
Well, he does speak about, if you think about the gods, he does say in book 10, when he comes to that topic, that they can't be emotional, they can't be angry, there are a whole lot of things that they can't be. So, excuse me. So clearly he's not thinking about the Greek gods that appear in Homer.
If he were, they would have executed him like they did Plato, Socrates, for impiety.
Exactly. Anyway, he does make the point at the end of chapter 10, though, that the best way to know virtue is to use as a measure the activities and the outlook and the values of a good man. I don't know if you can by reference imply the same thing about the gods. Maybe a good man is better than a bad god. I don't know. Maybe that's a takeaway. What do you all think?
Blasphemy.
Blasphemy.
Yeah. Well, I'm still sitting here, unstruck by happening so far in the session.
Well,
See how it-
Further blasphemy.
was anybody else sort of troubled by this sort of hierarchical patina or whatever that ran through my reading of chapter 10? I don't know, everything. He is pretty categorical in the sense of what's best or better or good, and you know, I in the end I thought being a philosopher and a lawyer were the greatest goods, and I accept that to some degree, but I just was,
Which part?
I found myself putting exclamation marks and question marks and my marginalia.
Yeah.
If any of you as a psychotherapist, I'm going to bring my book to you and let you help analyze myself, but I was off put by my reactions frequently.
But he's not talking about any old maker of laws. He's talking about an ideal maker of laws.
An expert
Yeah.
uses of making of laws, and I struggled to think of who he might mean. LBJ, I put in the margin because he was a master as Senate leader, and then he became president and so forth. And we look back on laws that were passed under his administration, we tend to think of as good. And anyway, my reading was just splattered with reactions. I had difficulty stringing it all together into what Aristotle was really saying.
Like a rabbit hole.
What was anyone else taken aback as I was in book 10 about when he suddenly introduces the idea of the intellect, which he has not talked about since a passing reference in book 1, I think. And now we're told, you know, forget everything I've been telling you. The most perfect life is that of the intellect, of contemplating the cosmology, I guess. And I thought, wait a minute, that's who's doing that? And you know,
Philosophers.
Horace is doing.
and okay.
Horace is doing.
I mean, is that just a little advertisement for philosophers? You know, you guys wouldn't have any of this figured out if it weren't for people like me.
Right.
You can live your active lives. You have to, because that's the only life you can live. But there are, fortunately, a few people like myself and Plato who can perform an even higher function, live an even better life. Is he saying?
The philosophers in Plato were kings.
Yeah.
Well, right. But is Aristotle?
We ruled it all.
Is he endorsing that notion here?
I put some notes in my margins here. I didn't have a chance to read all of chapter 10, but some of the notes I took were that contemplation is the highest form of happiness, and pleasure. Let's see, it's over here. People are unlikely to be naturally virtuous, but they have natural or innate tendencies that are either receptive to or adverse to accepting certain virtues. So between those two aspects, between contemplation and whether one is unlikely to be naturally virtuous, were things I got caught up in this chapter.
I just can't get my head around the idea that a life spent contemplating virtue is more virtuous than a life spent being virtuous or trying to be virtuous.
Yeah. That distinction between contemplation and action.
Contemplation, what does that count for? What does it mean?
Well, it's very pleasurable. It's leisurely. It's all these great goods and everything like that. But in the end, I think
But who does it benefit?
well, there you go. That's what I mean. I think he suggests that a man who translates the contemplation into action of some sort is a rank higher than the pure contemplator. I don't know.
But not
Well-
necessarily powerful.
Right.
Right.
Now, you could say that Aristotle, yes, a philosopher, a contemplative person, but also a teacher. He's a man of action in the sense that he is not simply thinking, he's also interacting. He's
Doing good by teaching.
That's his niche. That's where he can make his mark and contribute to the common weal, which seems to me to be a kind of unspoken part of this whole picture, that the flourishing life is one that also makes life more pleasant, if not always more virtuous for others. It brings more pleasure to others.
Why not bring in more virtue?
Well, it can in the sense that virtue, as we've said, is something that can be taught, or at least can be taught, I guess. Isn't that what Aristotle is doing? Is that what Aristotle is doing?
Well, he does seem to say that the good life involves living in a good society, and a good society comes about by people who have made the laws. And having laws, he says, is vital to having a good society. Yeah. And where do you get the good laws? You get them from good legislators who are also good people and know what being a good person is. So, we have a lot of legislators who we judge are not good people and who do not make good laws.
Yes.
And he doesn't want.
But there's the opposite of that. Take Charlie's LBJ example. He's probably a guy who had none of the moral virtues that Aristotle enunciates, but there were some pretty good laws passed under LBJ's term. So I'm not sure of that.
And there are a lot of legislators out there that are making bad laws, I think some of us would say, even today, and they're experts at making laws. It's just that and they're acting on what they think is virtuous, and they're closing down certain, let's say, basic rights, I think, purposefully.
Yeah.
And
in our minds, but not
in our minds. Yeah, it's impossible to read the chapter, frankly, without folding contemporary activities in translating into sense without parsing each of Aristotle's phrases.
To extend these perspectives slightly, Aristotle makes the bigger point that we need resources in addition to virtuous concepts and inclinations to become a virtuous person. We need to live in a civil society which is well ordered and well governed and has solid laws, for one thing. But we also need wealth. We need resources of a material kind in order to affect a good life, to bring it into existence, and to execute the notions that we've inculcated. So he makes this point strongly, and he makes it more than once in this last chapter. I think that's interesting as well. I mean, there seem to be he's he's balancing a lot of conflicting ideas and somehow trying to resolve them in this last chapter.
Yeah,
The,
the,
I'm
the
sorry.
end, yeah, it's the end of the semester syndrome. You know, he's got
Exactly.
got to cover. I got to cover this material,
Yep.
and also it's also the setting us up for the next book, isn't it, or the next. I don't know the sequence of his writings, but I would say that we're being set up for the politics here. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Politics was the spinoff.
The spin-off. That's right. The sequel. Politics. The sequel. Okay.
Oh, in book 10, he fulfills the promise of the earlier books. I don't remember whether it was 1, 2, or 3, but he says, later I will get into these in detail and about what happiness, fulfilling it, fulfilling life, thriving life. He tries to answer all that in chapter 10, which may be a sort of end of the semester problem, is he's trying to wrap up a tremendous amount of stuff in the way of his thinking in that one paragraph. And the one book, and the one thing that I had a little bit of problem with, I could understand his issue on pleasure and his arguments as to why pleasure is not the end all. And he, of course, there he's trying to argue against existing philosophers who were saying pleasure is everything. And I could sort of understand his thing about virtues and the mean. And I just felt it was a bit of a leap to go into the divine of reason.
Why does he do that?
I have a marginal note on book 10, chapter 8, that there you can fall back on moral virtue and practical wisdom if you're not in the full contemplative state, and that you can maybe gravitate between the two. So there was a lot in the book in the ethics on process. So it's a process to reach the ultimate happiness that he ascribes to the best of men. But if you don't make it quite there, then there's in chapter 8 he seems to say that you can fall back on just being what I put practical wisdom and moral virtue. So you don't have to sit there contemplating all the time, I guess.
Right. You can just do morally decent things.
Well,
there's nothing wrong with doing morally decent things. It's just you're not quite at the level of the divine, of the rationality, of the contemplative. So there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I would say he's definitely would say there's something wrong with saying all of ethics is pleasure and pain. That's not acceptable. But I think the virtuous life without reaching the divine is okay. It's just not the highest you can go in terms of a flourishing life.
or is it? A life like that, he says, after describing this contemplative life, is surely superhuman. That is to say, it isn't as a human being that you'll live a life like that. So what does that really translate into? It means, unless there is some kind of higher state of nirvana or something, that makes us divine, which he doesn't believe, I don't think, then it seems to me we just have to ignore this business about the contemplative life, because it's a throwaway. It doesn't really apply to us or to him or to anyone who's listening to him, and I don't think he intends it to. Why he puts it there, I don't know, but Charlie would say billable hours, but I don't think I just don't. I don't get it. It's confusing to me.
And one gets the impression that this is applying only to those of the highest intellect, instead of clarifying that we're talking about all levels of intellectual capacity. For example, he says here, but pleasure is desirable, but cannot say without qualification. You cannot live with, for example, live with stunted mentality of a child and have pleasure. But you can have pleasure at that level. I mean, that child may not quite understand the what's and the whys, but is he happy or is he feeling pain, even at that level of maturity? So if he's implying that the highest form of happiness is contemplation, that applies to all levels of intellect. Some are not capable of, the highest form of contemplation, either biologically or spiritually.
Well, right. I don't think he thinks anybody, no matter how intelligent, is capable of what he describes as the contemplative life. But I think another problem is that even without mentioning the intellect in chapters 1 through 9, he obviously is engaging his intellect and the intellects of those who are listening to him. This is difficult stuff that requires a lot of concentration and to say the least.
Yeah.
And I don't think he is unreal. I don't think he believes that any more than a fraction of the Greek population, taking into account slaves and women and people who've had no opportunity for any kind of education, are capable. This is an elite project, it seems to me. Not for us, but
yeah, this is what comes to my mind. Listening to this conversation is that it is rather elitist. Yeah.
Our conversation or his?
All of this general conversation.
Maybe could contemplation be a virtue, and that's just what it's about?
Well, he does say it is a virtue. It's not like the other virtues, which are moral virtues. This is an intellectual virtue. It's the only one.
On page
go ahead.
On page 259, he says, also people argue over whether what matters with moral goodness is choice and intention or actions. It seems to depend on both. So the complete package obviously must require both. And for actions, you need lots of resources. And the greater the actions and the more honorable they are, the more you need. So I think that addresses this issue of a hierarchy. The more resources you have in terms of family background, in terms of political associations, in terms of outright wealth, the easier it is to do great works and to be a truly virtuous person at a high degree. He also argues that it's some combination of both the intellectual capability to make good choices and the penchant for action to put those good choices into effect that matter. Both are required for virtue.
So that takes us back.
Explicit as he gets, I think.
Yeah. And doesn't that take us back to the concept of moral luck that we read about? That is,
and the cave. I mean, who's to judge who goes into the cave or should be in the cave?
Right.
What level of intellectual capacity is acceptable?
Well, most people have been dealt a pretty bad hand when it comes to moral luck. If it seems to me, most people in the world at any given moment have not, have been deprived of a lot of the resources that a small number of us, small fraction of us, take for granted. But it's precisely those resources that Aristotle is addressing as part of what makes the virtuous life, the flourishing life, possible, if not to attain, then at least to strive for.
Yes, I agree, and that's the hierarchical underpinning of the whole argument, I think, because as Ron points out, to get there, you need resources, even. So it's hard for the common man, so to speak, to be both contemplative, have the time to think these things through, get on with life,
Yeah.
and be flourishing. And in the end, he's the only people who can do that are rich, highly educated, morally lucky.
And smart.
I just read this morning.
Concerning wealth, you don't need a lot of money.
No,
you don't need to be wealthy, but you need to be comfortable, as we put it today, I think.
Yeah, because otherwise, if you're not comfortably off, as Richard puts it, then you're kind of struggling to make ends meet, and you don't have the time or energy to be a good person, especially to have some time set aside for doing what we are doing right now.
I'm not sure I agree with that, Forrest. I get up at about 3 a.m. every morning and contemplate for about a half hour until I fall back to sleep. So however well off I might be, I think I would still be doing that, whatever my financial circumstances might be.
You'd be doing that all day long?
No, just for a half hour. I find that sufficient.
Sufficient for what? To get back to sleep, or
just plain sufficient, Richard?
That's not setting the bar all that high.
I think Aristotle makes this clear again on page 261, line, 13 or 14. He says, it's perfectly possible to do the things you ought to do as a good person with only a modest amount of property. So there's a threshold involved. I mean, you need a starter set of, you need a 401k or something, starter set for you.
Yeah, my marginalia said Abraham Lincoln and U.S. Grant came to mind as people of rather modest means who performed glorious deeds.
Good. Nice
But
examples.
And
we hold those two people, if we know about them, we hold them in very high esteem, don't we?
Yes, over time, because they were people of modest means who lived virtuous, arguably, lives and did it consistently. And they were both thoughtful people, I think, based on what historians have been able to explain.
The first, you said Lincoln?
Lincoln and U.S. Grant.
And Grant. Well, certainly Lincoln, I think you have to say, was born with some disposition toward virtue, as well as intellectual capacity. And yet you could argue, looking at his entire life, that he didn't really begin to apply to achieve greatness until he was comfortably off, as he was by the time he hit his 40s and had a thriving law practice. Before that, it was kind of preparation and acclimation and habituation and so forth.
But see, I would argue that he's a good example of somebody who had innate
Yeah.
virtues, and
I agree.
who then applied them in a habitual way to learn how to go to law school, to apprentice as a lawyer, to practice law, so that he could eventually run for Congress and be an implementer, if you will, of laws. So he's a useful foil, at least for me, to lay against the construct that I've been creating out of my argument.
But just sticking with Lincoln for a moment, you can't say anything very positive about his experience, his term in Congress, or maybe it was two. He accomplished very little, partly because very little was possible for an individual congressman to do. But it was only later that circumstances presented him with the kind of opportunity to realize his potential.
Well, one could say the same true of Grant. I happen to be a fan of Grant. I read his book. He was a really smart guy and thoughtful guy, and I think in a moral guy, even though there's been a huge debate about deaths on the battlefield. But certainly he did not excel until he became a general. I mean, he was a total failure in life up until that point of time. And then this opportunity presented itself and he could flourish.
Right. Until he moved on to an even higher position in which he did not flourish.
Well, true. Well, he allowed people to take advantage of him and ran a corrupt administration, but then again, he turned around, with Mark Twain helping him to write his book. So yeah, he was not the greatest president.
He wasn't an
maybe
expert.
Not the worst anymore.
True.
I can't help but think about Robert E. Lee along the same vein. He was a brilliant strategist, but he blew it. And then he supported a cause for the wrong reasons. So once again, you have to balance the good and the evil that he represented.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. Is the utilization of these historic figures, or anybody else we could come up with, a useful way to test, if you will, some of Aristotle's thinking? I found it more helpful to myself to just watch my own reactions and in my marginalia than it was to try to figure out exactly what Aristotle was saying or concluding.
That's a good question.
I think again here, Aristotle comes to his own rescue. And he tells us explicitly what he has in mind on page 263, where he says, but as it is, they only seem to have the power to motivate and encourage young men of gentlemanly character. They can take an already noble nature, genuinely devoted to what's honorable, and make it ready for goodness to take hold. But with most people, that is, the common people, arguments seem powerless to motivate them to become decent men. The trouble is that common people, by their nature, don't respond to shame. The only response they have is to fear. They don't refrain from bad behavior because it's shameful. They need the threat of punishment.
Oh, yeah, that's very good.
I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about where he stands with regard to this issue of nature and nurture, at least with regard to to ascending the final rungs on the ladder up to a truly virtuous character.
Doesn't that seem pretty reductive to say that common people only respond to fear? They don't respond to.
I agree. Yeah.
Elitist.
Yeah.
But
No,
in response, to Charlie's comment about whether or not it's productive to apply some of this theory to historic figures, in a way, this is what happens when I'm reading this, that I have to put something definable in my head so that I can relate to what he's trying to say. And sometimes this happens, I can establish a form of thought and follow him by identifying either myself or someone else with what he is presenting so that it makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I did too. I have it all over the margins about specific ideas of people who are not well known, and especially who are very common. Having worked with indigenous people and Native Americans and people who are common people, they possess these qualities as well. Just we don't hear about them. We don't know about them. There's people that have spoken to me with such wisdom, had no education, no wealth, no knowledge, would never be in a class like this, but the wisdom can come through. So you can you can hear it, you can feel it when you talk to certain people. I'm sure everybody here has done that at some point, where you just get something, even if it's from a minister or a priest giving a sermon at a funeral. There is something that can reach out to you and touch you, and this is just another priest or minister or whatever. They don't, it can come through just in regular people instead of elites.
Yeah, I think that he allows for that, but there just are not very many of those people. And you're suggesting, Lucy, that are a lot. I suppose that we have to appeal to our own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And excuse me, without going into details, there seem to be presently a lot of people who are, as Hillary would say, undesirable.
Deplorable.
Deplorables. Yeah.
That's deplorable. In using modern people to evaluate Aristotle is a little hard, because Aristotle didn't have the tools that we have today, the thought tools. I mean, I think most of us agree that enslaving people is wrong. And so when you start going, well, how many people are around? How are you going to judge somebody as to whether they enslaved people or not? That would be meaningless to Aristotle. I don't think he had, I think he's amazing in the sense of it's a phenomenal thought experiment that he ran here in this book, of just sitting down, looking at people and coming up with all these ideas. But the culture he was in, we think in a lot broader ways today than I think he even had the skills to do.
Including, now most of us who are thoughtful people, at least, include women, obviously.
Oh, yes, them. Yes, you're right. And he didn't.
And Forrest, I am still really hung up on the fact that the word conscience never surfaces in any of this. And what is it that he applies in his words to what is, as we know it, our conscience? Because for me, one of the most important reasons for what we do and why we do it. But yet he seems to go all around the mulberry bush without specifically referring to our consciences.
Well, could he be referring to being contemplative as a consciousness?
But there, I would think that contemplation is an intellectual exercise, not necessarily conscience in terms of understanding what holds you back from doing evil.
But you would have to be extremely, and so unrealistically, virtuous by nature or by your upbringing. But people can't, how many people can actually live that way? We all encounter problems of some sort for which we have to make a choice. And making a choice involves our thinking.
Is thinking equivalent to conscience?
I think conscience seems to me to be a kind of thinking, a kind of self-knowledge. What's the root of that? I mean, science, knowledge, right? Conscience, isn't that where it comes from?
Yeah.
And that's Greek. So there's something here that suggests knowing something. And in the case of conscience, it would seem to be knowing something about yourself. Maybe it has, even though he doesn't use the word, maybe it would apply here to some sense of wanting to be more virtuous, having imbibed that desire through whatever processes, and knowing kind of where you stand on the scale, where you need work, and so forth, and being honest and truthful to yourself about that.
He does talk about regret. I don't know if, where in deciding whether something was free or a free choice or not, the virtue of it in part depends on whether you felt regret afterwards. I don't know if that's quite conscious, though. I don't know, but I mean, he does at least admit to regret of someone making a choice and going, that was a mistake.
Well, along those lines, I think that conscience is the capacity to have a sense of shame for some action you've taken that you ought to be feeling a sense of shame for. And I'm not sure Aristotle ever addresses that. I have the note at the very end of this, I have a big exclamation point. He seems to think that the moral education is best left to the state to handle. And given what we may be contemplating of the next 4 years, maybe that's not such a good idea, I'm thinking.
But. Well, yeah, he has a certain kind of state in mind, I think.
Oh, Tony, you have muted yourself. Tony, can you hear me?
We can't hear you.
Oh, there. Sorry.
There.
I had to mute the puppy. So I have a sense, a feeling. I have contemplated the fact that conscience is at the core of human behavior. What drives us to do and to know the difference between what is wrong, what keeps us from committing evil, what steers us in the right direction. Conscience to me is almost everything. And I keep trying to look at what and how Aristotle presents his theories of human behavior and how what is it that conscience relates to him that relates to us? Or was the word or the concept at his time, not such that he would refer to it that way.
When, like you, I mean, you are all being very Aristotelian, I think, in this discussion. And like you, Aristotle gives us examples all the time. He often goes to medicine for an example. If you're a doctor, if you're a good doctor, which is the only kind of a doctor you should ever strive to be, you have to have knowledge about the human body. He says that there might be people who, in a particular case, can help heal somebody, but that you wouldn't want those people to be doctors if they didn't study medicine. And that doesn't come about without thinking.
That, right.
Well, I think Aristotle distinguishes man from the animal based on his intelligence. Isn't that?
Good.
Right.
Yeah.
Doesn't that run through it?
Yeah.
And the ability to reason. Yeah.
And that kind of leads into the contemplative life, because that's
or just a life of considered action, deliberate action.
Yeah.
Action that is always informed by choices, making choices, being aware of those choices, weighing, competing values, all of that. That's the intellect at work.
And the conscience too.
And the conscience.
And the conscience too.
Well, I mean, conscience is a byproduct of that, I think. It
tells us what to do. Doesn't conscience tell us what to do with bad stuff? Like, it is what makes us feel guilt and shame and those things. Like, I can't do that because that's wrong. It's like a built-in little monitor that I guess you got from your upbringing or somewhere. It says, tells you what right, wrong, and what right feels like and what wrong feels like what a toothache feels like and a healthy tooth feels like. And
it's that I think is the hardest thing to describe. That which,
Yeah.
that what is it how do you define that? I mean, is it biological group of cells or physiological or outer worldly, or what is that's in there that differentiates our thinking from that of animals and flowers or whatever. But I think that's what's the hardest thing for us to define, and what he goes all around, the universe with. What is that? Is it, if you say, well, it gives us the ability to make the right decisions. Well, what is it? What is it that's giving you that ability?
It's moral intelligence, whatever that is. It's a knowledge of one's self, and a kind of understanding of the options that are open to you, and a sense that, by the way, I think can change. When I think back, I was a conscience-ridden child. I was always worried and feeling, and it was because I knew so little. Because I just knew a few things, a few standards, and I couldn't weigh them. I couldn't. I had no perspective, no experience. As I got older, my conscience eased up considerably, thank goodness, and became more mature and more reasonable. and a better guide to life than it had been when I didn't know very much. I think whatever, I don't know what, we're groping for some sort of a
Definition.
a definition, but it is, maybe we just know it when we feel it. We all have it.
Yeah, I feel like it's something metaphysical that you can't put your finger on.
Well,
it's it.
sure.
You know,
Although
There are lots of things like that, though, that
you can
we don't quite
Louisiana is requiring the posting of the 10 Commandments in every public school classroom beginning in the 2025 semester. So I assume those kids will be extremely moral by the time they are at their high school commencement.
Yeah.
maybe not.
That ought to do it.
It shows you what those expert legislators can do.
Yeah.
I think the closest that Aristotle comes to actually pinning down this question of conscience, how big it is, where it resides, how we can gain access, is on page 258. I apologize for citing so much Aristotle, but anyway.
Very helpful.
Okay.
Underscore.
It's
You said-
a detective character, Ron.
I'm sorry. Say again.
Never
I missed it. So he says, so if intellect is something divine compared to the human being, then a life of the intellect is also a divine life in comparison with a human life. But that doesn't mean that we have to follow the motto and think human, since we're human, or think on moral things, since we're mortal. No, we should transcend our mortality as much as possible and do everything we can to live out life by the very best elements within us. Yes, it may be small in bulk, but in its power and exaltedness, it far surpasses everything else we have. So I think that this refers as concretely and specifically as possible to a little tiny speck of us that is transcendent, that is difficult simply to develop internally or by habitation or whatever. It's this spark of the divine that's ultimately our guide. It's our conscience. Does that make sense to anyone else?
Yes, that's great. Very helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
Something else I wondered about, and I wonder if any of you did too. At some point in this text, and I was trying to find this quote, he refers to this dizzying sense of transformation that an honorable person experiences, in addition to the intellectual knowledge that he or she doing the right thing. Do you remember that phrase? It was kind of difficult to understand. I read it 3 times to myself, the last time out loud, and I still couldn't understand what he was saying. And I can't find the reference here. I've been leafing through my dog-eared pages, and I can't recover it. Does that ring a bell with anyone else? Anyway, I apologize. Maybe
Well,
that was
one of the continuing threads of this conversation is my reaction again that there's a sort of elitist moment that some of us are lucky enough to have, this spark of conscience that enables us, because of our training, habits, context, talents, characters, to not be a deplorable. And there's something disturbing, hierarchical about all of that I can't quite reconcile, frankly. We hear, we band of brothers, so to speak. I have the benefit and luck to take an Aristotle course and to chew on these issues carefully and find lines in Aristotle's texts which reinforce not only his reasoning, but our intuitive sense of what conscience is and who's a good person, and Abraham Lincoln. And, it's very gratifying. but there's something so rarefied about the whole thing that is, I don't know, troublesome. And so I like it, but I feel kind of so I just sent you all an article. I'm influenced in what I'm saying because I read a book review on the Washington Post this past weekend in the book world on a new book on anti-wokeism. And I'm sending it to you because I think it relates to both sides of this issue, if you will, of querying how we are both blessed. He uses the word blessed a lot.
That's not James Carville, is it?
No, it's somebody I don't know. It's a book review.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's we are blessed to have this course, to have each other, to have the brains, talent, patience, and time and good fortune to be able to spend the time and read it in our leisure, pleasurably, using all these Aristotelian words. And yet you come out feeling, gee whiz, I'm not only good, but I'm lucky and I hope I'm flourishing type thing. It's all very informative. My vocabulary has expanded dramatically, but I'm not sure I have a tight grip.
I think you have no overdeveloped conscience. You have the kind of conscience I had when I was 8. You need to work on that. You need to
my late in life problems. I don't know.
Maybe we go back to being more childlike.
No, thank you.
Maybe the next book we do ought to be J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah. Talk about going backwards.
It wasn't a
I like
bad
to go back to something that Lance said earlier, that what distinguishes us from the other animals is that we can think in ways that they cannot. So thus it is in some sense a defining element in human beings. You can't be fully a human being unless you are thinking, as well as being virtuous in your behavior, of course. You've got to be a really well-functioning person, you've got to be both. You've got to be morally virtuous, and you've got to be a person who spends some time thinking about things.
But doesn't the one imply the other? Doesn't to be moral and virtuous, don't you have to spend some time thinking about being moral and virtuous?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is that application.
No, that doesn't.
But there also is a kind of thinking that doesn't have application.
Didn't Descartes speak to that kind of? He said, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
What it is.
But, cowards and grumpy, shameless people are also thinkers. Can be immoral.
No, definitely.
Yes.
But
They're also thinkers.
They're not really people that we admire, are they?
No.
No, but we're not talking about people we admire. We're kind of trying to understand what kind of people are capable of what kind of actions. For example, people who pleasure being the highest form of a virtue or a desired form. People who do evil things take pleasure from that evil. So.
And they think about it.
Or not.
Well, Hitler was a thinker. You can be a highly immoral, but still above average intelligence person.
So there's good pleasure and bad pleasure.
So who,
Yeah.
this is a little off topic, but who is Aristotle influenced by as a child?
His father.
His father.
Wasn't
I
he a
mean, in
student of
society,
Plato?
like in society, like I was heavily influenced by the Catholic Church as a child, not as an adult, but as a child, which is why probably I have a conscience because of that influence. I'm wondering about Aristotle.
I don't remember Forrest maybe can answer. Did the academy that Aristotle went to, had Plato already passed away by then, or
Oh,
would he
no,
have
no.
actually interacted with Plato?
Oh, he was interactive with Plato.
So he certainly rebelled against Plato. I mean,
In some
his,
respects.
in many, yeah, I think in he didn't believe in the forms, and he didn't. I mean, so I don't know. You can say that maybe Plato was a little bit of a counter influence on him. I don't know. I guess where is the idea that his father was an influence on him? Was that, have historians
Yeah,
discussed that issue?
yeah, it was at the beginning of the book, and it talked about how the reason for the title of the book and the influence that his father had on him, and then how he passed that on to his son. But it didn't go into, I don't recall any specifics about what exactly influenced Aristotle, what influence he had from his father, only that he revered him and tried to continue his tradition of his father.
He does say about Plato, excuse me, at least two things. One, Plato focuses just on the ideal, the forms, whereas Aristotle is looking at how people actually live.
Right.
Right.
And furthermore, Aristotle says, knowing of the sort that Plato wants us to do is not enough.
Right.
In fact, knowing of the sort that Plato wants to do, he says, doesn't thereby knowing what virtue is doesn't thereby make us virtuous.
Well, to me, that seems to downgrade the value of intellect. If anything, it means that behavior is more important than thought in some ways. So, without renouncing, this goes back to the question that I had when we started, which was, where did intellect suddenly come from? He hasn't talked about that at all, and now suddenly he's telling us that it's the highest virtue because it's the most human virtue. It defines us as humans, but we don't get a whole lot, except that then that kind of gets tied up with the idea of the contemplative life, which is beyond all of us. So I find something maybe contradictory there. The thing that makes us most human is also beyond our capacity. That doesn't, maybe that's too glib, but it doesn't quite work for me. I was thinking the other day, if you had, if I had been asked a month ago, who are the most virtuous people you know? I would have come up with a list. Any one of us would have come up with a list. Usually people we know, I suppose. maybe people that we only know from a distance, but we could all come up with a half a dozen people. Now that we have been exposed to this tight analysis of virtue, I wonder if our list would be any different. Would we take people off because we now understand that either they don't possess a sense of humor, or something else, or that we don't know that they possess those things, and therefore we're not quite so sure that what we see is virtue.
And what degree and what degree of badness is acceptable before you leave the realm of being virtuous?
Right.
That's a gray area that he talks about, I think, if I recall, in general, but he doesn't really give us an answer to it. There's no black and white there, but to understand a virtuous person is to have an understanding that, one, they're not perfect, and two, they have made wrong decisions, and three, that they may have done something outstanding, and then all of a sudden do something that is egregiously wrong. So is he still a virtuous person, or all these good acts kind of thrown out the window because of this one bad act? Those are things to me that trying to define a virtuous person it is almost like a slippery eel. You know, there's too many gradations of decision making, and so how can you possibly judge the level of virtuousness when no one is perfect? Now, of course, you have the extremes of someone who lives their life committing evil acts, but the majority of humankind, I think, is probably somewhere in the middle.
Well, and it goes back to that great list on page 40 of, going too far and falling short. And
Yeah.
So my list, in response to Richard's comment, my list is much greater, because now the people that I thought were so wonderful because they went too far, they've got bumped off the list now, because now I see moderation, which I think is an instinct that has been an instinct of mine. I just didn't know it until I have thought about this. That moderation thing is so applicable to all that we're talking about.
So what, did you get rid of Melissa Gates because she gives away too much?
No, not her, but I can.
Okay. Right.
I didn't think about her.
Okay.
But I thought about a lot of people that, can, have a really bad temper, or be very full of themselves because they've got amazing credentials, but they just don't find that middle of the road stuff to be, an important part of their lives or something like that. I don't know. It's hard to talk about.
It's an ongoing process for Aristotle, I think, isn't it? I mean, it's a goal that you try to reach through your entire life, and it's just the process of attempting to do that, I think, that Aristotle speaks to. And if you ultimately get there, I guess you're ultimately happy, but that isn't his definition of happiness, is reaching that ultimate goal. And I thought, last week, which my first week in the class was, I took real issue with the idea that it's innate. But the more I thought about it, the more I'm thinking is that these virtues probably are innate, and that at least most everybody possesses them, and they need to be brought out. And I don't think they're brought out necessarily the way Aristotle might have thought, through some type of upper class, upper middle class habituation, but rather there are many different ways that one's innate moral virtue can surface. And I gave last week the example of a death row inmate that I had come in contact with early in my law school career, who was an extremely moral individual. And I just don't think he had the habituation that Aristotle contemplated, but somehow innately he achieved it. So I came to say that, I guess yes, there are innate moral virtues that can be brought out, but not necessarily the way Aristotle might have thought.
Well, it gives you a pause before making any judgments these days, because you have to run it through a bunch of new filters that we've learned about in assessing somebody or your own performance. Query what's going on, you find yourself asking. There are values that he articulates that I fully endorse, and yet putting them into practical application to either life or history is a ongoing challenge. So in that sense, it is aspirational. I like that. It is practical in the sense that it is useful to have these new tools. But I just am enjoying the expansion, if you will, of the complexity of the whole situation.
I thought that we had kind of reached an agreement last week that by innateness he means a capacity.
Yeah, capacity.
Right.
Mhm.
And that most people are born with this capacity. There are a few who are not, but that seems to be a minority, a large minority of people who are handicapped at birth.
We could probably think of one egregious example of that, Forrest,
Yeah.
that currently running for president. But
Well, I love the concept of capacity. We all have this innate, intuitive reaction to a newborn baby or a young child, where we all see them as a crucible or a capacity of good life, flourishing, learning, etc. And we all take an intuitive reaction to them, to nurture them, to teach them good values, to feed them well, and so forth. And all of that is part of the, I like to think, habituation. Aristotle calls them the social norms, which I think is another useful term. And that's all sort of instinctive and natural to both us as older people who are seeing our opportunity to help the capacity of a new child to flourish.
That makes
but there's the opposite of that as well, because in the eighth grade, I was in a production of South Pacific, and the song from that show was "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught."
Right.
And what you've got to be carefully taught is to hate and to have prejudices, and so many habituation is also of inculcating in a child those prejudices and those biases that you possessed and that you may have gotten as you were habituated. So it runs both ways.
Yeah.
And Aristotle allows for that. That's why number one, child rearing is so important, and number two, why education is so important. You can't become a good person, or the odds are certainly very strong against that. You can't become a good person without becoming educated.
Oh.
Educated.
But not educated educated scholastically, but educated morally.
Yes.
which can happen in a lot of places like prison, apparently.
Yeah.
Not often, I wouldn't think, but just,
But education, as we speak of it, as opposed to simply child rearing, education does not deal with morality. It deals with thinking.
well, yes
We,
and no.
we are pretty suspect, many of us, not all of us, but most of us here, I would think, we're pretty suspect of institutions that are trying to promote a certain moral position.
And explicitly,
We tend to exclude that from the academy that we envision as a good one.
all right. Well, a first grade teacher is in a public school, spends a lot of her time teaching morality, how kids should treat each other, how they should behave in a social setting, how they should behave toward the teacher, etc.
Yeah.
That's moral education.
Yeah.
Fortunate, and you could also attach a religious element to it if you in a different setting, but you don't have to. So I would say that when we talk about education, we are talking about, at least at a very basic level, a moral content.
Yeah. I immediately take back what I just said.
Yeah, because you sort of learn everything that's important in life before you're 5 years old.
And our grandson is going to Georgetown, a Jesuit institution, and he was saying that the old saying was the Jesuits give me a child until he's 7 years old, and then I will have accomplished everything that's needed.
Yeah.
And
in my elementary school class, we had a big sign up that said courtesy is contagious, but apparently some of my classmates had been vaccinated against it and it never caught it.
Even in higher education, there is that moral element. For instance, we accuse people in higher education, if we have good grounds, of plagiarizing.
yeah,
And that is both a moral issue, as Richard suggests, as well as an intellectual. It violates moral standards as well as intellectual standards.
Right.
So when I say I take back, Richard immediately refuted what I said, and I agree with his refutation.
I mean, it's, plagiarism is cheating. You learn that when you're 3 years old, 4 years old. You don't cheat.
Or it may take later on, even. As as Lance's people in prison, some of them finally kind of see the light morally, or are helped to do that if they're in a good prison system. Unfortunately, solitary confinement doesn't really contribute to human development by those people.
Yeah.
Unless they're given Aristotle to read.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Can I ask? We have another class, don't we? This is
One
not
more.
the end. One more,
Yeah.
and yet haven't we finished the book?
Well, we have, but we haven't read the intervening chapters 4 through 9 yet. And I put 8 because 8 just thrilled me.
Uh-oh.
It focuses on friendship, and as all of you know, I'm sure, friendships become dearer later in life. I think they become more dear late in life. And if you have friends when you are in your 90s, as I am, friendships are a very dear thing. And you're really lucky if you have them.
Yeah, I read the chapter this morning, actually, number 8, and it is touching to parse your personal experience carefully. He helps you. And I agree that what Forrest is saying is that he analyzes all different kinds of friendships, useful ones, pleasant ones, golfing pals, schoolmates, partners, et cetera, and that you'll find again in your marginalia. I wager a litany of various types of friends that you've had, which is informative as well as enriching and endearing.
Okay, well, we'll take that up then in our last class a week from now. So we better stop. I think our time is, oh, no. I look at my room. No, we still have a few minutes.
Well, as I said, I sent you this book review about wokeism, but it applies to the earlier part of our conversation in chapter 10 in particular, I think, about wokeism and what may be a current controversy, and this insight in this review. I couldn't help but think about both our conversation and chapter 10, as well as the construct that I've perceived in his arguments, which is hierarchical and quite elitist. And we all would applaud it, I think, for our own experiences and so forth, but it raises certain questions that I think the book suggests are worth considering. As I read the review. Anyway, that's you'll find it in your email, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
I'd
you.
like to leave you with a question, and this is a real question. What of your questions do you feel our conversation has answered in a satisfactory way, and which of your questions have not yet been answered? So let me leave you with that as a intervening project. Which of your questions do you still have for Aristotle? And which of your questions have you been helped toward an answer through our shared discussions?
And how many are blurrier than ever?
But one reminder that I put in my note that I sent to you, one reminder, Aristotle says this is not an exact science.
Here.
Right.
You have to keep that in mind. Okay, see you next week.
Thank you for the good
Okay.
speaking.
Thank you. See you
Thank you
next
all.
week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank all